Frank was actually very punctual. He kept it to his 15 minutes.
Me.
I did. Let me exercise a prerogative of the moderator here and sort of throw out the first question. It has to do with foreign direct investment. 30-some years ago, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on this topic, and basically attracting foreign direct investment is very hard. Countries compete for foreign direct investment. You all will remember President Reagan's Caribbean Basin Initiative trying to do that. As Carlos mentioned, in the private sector, in the United States and when you have particularly publicly traded companies, the first thing you do is you call your legal counsel and you say, advise me on this. I cannot imagine legal counsel advising anyone to invest in a regime like the Cuban regime, with all these issues regarding international labor organizations, with all the corruption and all that implies that you're going to have to bribe somebody in order to do business and so on and so forth. So my question, I guess, is, if they're trying to attract foreign direct investment, do they really understand the process? Do they really understand what it would take to attract FDI, or are they just blinded or doing it for other reasons? Carlos, let me throw it at you.
Well, first, it's difficult to see what the rationale is. I cannot figure out the rationale. I can look at it two different ways. One way is the kind of Alice in Wonderland type of projections that they're making. They're talking about that they need about $2.5 billion a year, $2,500 million in new investments in Cuba. But if you look at the stock of investment in Cuba and compare, let's say, with Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic, the stock of investments in Costa Rica at this moment is $16 billion. The stock in the Dominican Republic is $17 billion. The stock of foreign investment in Cuba is estimated at $500 million. So you're talking that they're going to go basically from 500 to 2,500 to 2.5 billion 1 year after another.
Every year, right?
Every year, that seems to be a little bit of a Alice in Wonderland, even in the best of circumstances. Even in the best of circumstances. Now, if you look at the foreign investment law, like I said before, it's really a nightmare. You know, they have this mechanism where they will the same mechanism that they had before, where the investor pays, let's say, $1,000 to the government, and the worker gets a portion of that. The rest is kept. Now that has, from an analytical point of view, that's a real problem, because that means that the foreign investor is not really utilizing the comparative advantage that Cuba could have by having a lower labor cost. So really, they are using a system which puts the foreign investment at a disadvantage by asking them to pay international prices for labor and then paying the labor a very, very low price. So that's, from an analytical point of view, that seems to be a big problem. The other big problem is that, like you know, foreign investors don't really like to make enclave except in certain industry, like mining or oil. That's where you can have enclave. Foreign investors would like to have a system where they can use not only the infrastructure, but the only industrial infrastructure that the country has. And Cuba has very little other infrastructure of that. Now, the other, it is really very generous in a way, a very generous foreign investment law. But like I said before, and like to say, I would say that they probably will attract some investors like they have done in Spain or maybe Brazil, where they get, maybe they will get even better treatment than the law has. But it's not likely, in my view, it's not likely to attract any serious foreign investors from other countries.
I think Randy had a question?
Yeah, good morning. Hey, congratulations, Dr. Azel and the Institute. What a great panel you put together. I want to ask you a little bit open to the panel, on what your sense is on the politics. We have, for instance, one of the gubernatorial candidates here in Florida that just announced to Cuba that they should take away the embargo and so on and so forth. Do you get a sense, all of you, that this is a new push going on to try to do something about this? And please, I would like you to address within that answer to perhaps in my real situation, people in Cuba, some of the academics there, highlight the ones that are adept to the regime, and one gets the information, right? But they highlight and they have a lot of hopes regarding Mariel. Do you get a sense of the foreign investment law, the new law, really is meant to go a lot more into Mariel with maquilladoras and basically slave Cuban labor? What's your sense on those two issues? Thank you.
Anybody want to take a or Frank or?
Sure.
Mario?
Let me start by saying that yes, there's a new push. There's a new push that you can sense in many different ways. Among a handful of people on Capitol Hill that give the regime the benefit of the doubt, but they are a distinct minority. There is a generalized consensus, both the House and the Senate. There is a chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, Mr. Menendez, who not only supports what in my view is the right policy, but he's a constant advocate, despite the fact that perhaps some folks in the White House would like to go in another direction. But Menendez is constantly reminding them of the real nature of the Castro government. This is not an ideological issue. The push is exemplified also by the tremendous effort. The Cuba Study Group last year tried very hard to get the Cuba out of the terrorist list, and they failed. And again, this year, they failed one more time. It would be very difficult for the Obama administration to get Havana out of a list of governments supporting terrorism in the aftermath of a North Korean ship taking warplanes. Now, lawyers and advocates of a soft policy toward Cuba will tell you that that's not related to terrorism. Well, in the eyes of the Congress and in the eyes of the media and the American people, it is related to terrorism. And it's a lot more significant to many people than perhaps Cuba giving safe haven to some American terrorists who killed a police officer many years ago. So the bottom line is, how could the United States lift some of these sanctions that would open up the foreign sources of dollars for those $2,500 million a year that they want, while Havana remains on the terrorist list. And so that is the big question in there. As far as the governor of Florida, frankly, I don't think he's very credible in this area. Don't want to get involved in Florida politics, but other folks have gone to the island and said the same things, but confronted with a critic that has the facts on hand, I think he's doing a disservice to himself if he finally goes to Cuba.
Randy, let me ask, the first part, the political part, I think to some degree this is probably a response to the poll by the Atlantic Council that came out a few months ago, and some of you know that I criticized very, very heavily in one of my articles because the methodology was really flawed from my point of view. But when you look at Mariel, you know, and I think Carlos also alluded at this, when you're having even an assembly plant, you have to have the intermediate products. And Cuba does not produce a lot of intermediate products. I remember years ago, we actually were manufacturing some very simple calculators in China, and I had to go all the time because if they ran out of a little screw or the glue or something, it was not to be found in China. So you had to go to Japan, buy it, bring it back to China so the plant could continue, the assembly plant. So Cuba doesn't produce a lot of the intermediate components. So I don't see how that actually could develop. Juan, I think I had a question, or Teo, well, start one or the other. Go.
Two questions. One, as you studied the self-employment, how much corruption was involved in that sort of trail? And specifically, if you saw that corruption, where? And then the other question is on the currency exchange. You mentioned 24 to 1. What's the real market set exchange rate for Cuban pesos to coups? It's easy to say 10, 24, but is there any kind of formula that you can say, well, the real value should be 9 or 52?
Okay, let me respond. The self-employment, the corruption, I'm trying to sort of frame the question, right? So, are you asking about the corruption behind the data, or?
No, the corruption in the system of self-employment.
I see.
In the private sector.
Okay.
Whatever you want to call it.
All right. Yeah, that's, I had the same question too, and I find it difficult to come up with statistics, right? But what I can tell you is that there is, in sourcing, right? In sourcing the intermediate products and the finished products that people are selling, that's where the corruption steps in. And it's not only corruption that's being deviated from, from pilfering from state enterprises for your own consumption. So in essence, I think your question revolves around the something that I wanted to quantify, but I find it very difficult to quantify, which is, has the amount of desvíos or pilfering increased proportionally as self-employment has increased? Anecdotally, without any statistical data, reliable data, the answer will be yes, right? Because it makes sense for people to, to source. And part of the problem, and, I didn't really have a lot of time to elaborate on it, is the lack of input market. And I read somebody who wrote a paper, one of the problems is the inexistence of fair input markets. And I wrote to the author and I said, what do you mean fair input markets? You mean markets where the price system functions, right? And where you have some currency, whether it's pesos convertible, moneda nacional, or dollars, right? Which could be, dollarization could be, a currency scheme for a country like Cuba, who knows? But the answer is yes. The answer is that more than likely, and there's no data anywhere published by anyone. The only anecdotal data comes from some sotto voce, from Juventud Rebelde, and they'll allude to that, which is the only paper, right, of the 5 or 6 state papers that sometimes in Trabajadores they'll throw an article, and they'll say, oh, well, but they don't associate it directly with that, but I'm presuming that the answer will be definitely yes, yeah.
One, with respect to, obviously, Cuba's currency does not trade freely in the market, so you don't really have an idea. But the underlying reason why anyone would want any country's currency is the demand for the products of that country. So if the Cuban currency were to float freely, you would only want to buy pesos if you wanted to buy Cuban products. So it has to go back to what the country produces. and the desire for a country's product. If there's no desire for the products of Cuba, there will be no desire for Cuba's currency. Teo?
I also have just two very quick questions related to the presentations, Jose. Thank you very much. One was during Mario's presentation, when you were talking about the not favorable activity that's taken place towards the business for the self-employment initiatives that are going on, you used the word that there was limited microcredit, microfinance.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I would like you to tell me what, if it's limited, what microcredit, microfinance exists in Cuba? Because I know of none.
Okay.
So I'd love to find out. And then also, Carlos, in your presentation, you never talked about the settlement of the foreign debt that's taken place, the aggressive settlement of foreign debt. The Russians just forgave 28 billion dollars. The Cubans are out there talking to the Paris Club about the settlement. If they do settle with the Paris Club, what effect would that have? What is the impact of those settlements? Those are my...
Can I?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the question. That's certainly a topic that I kind of omitted, again, to be economical with time, right? So the Banco Popular de Ahorro and the Banco Metropolitano in Havana offer microcredit, microloans, and they began to offer these microloans for construction or repairs of home properties, right? And so the real story is that these microloans, you fill an application, you go to the Banco Metropolitano, the rest of the country, the Banco Popular de Ahorro, you go through a process, but there's no FICO system of credit score, right? So the question to me as an economist right away came like, what are the lending standards? So I researched the lending standards, couldn't find much about that, all right? What I only found was that these could be in small amounts, and we're talking, if you convert them to dollars at the exchange rate, we're talking the average loan is about $55. So construction, and if you know Cuba, what I like to tell people, the real Cuban economy, $55 doesn't get you much in terms of home construction or improvement or anything like that. The other interesting aspect of microcredit and microfinance is that the one for home improvement and for personal loans for small businesses is not collateralized by real property, by residential real property. And the government says, well, we're good. We're not going to do what the evil capitalists do, which is, lend to people, subprime lending and predatory lending and so on, right? And then you get on the agricultural side, which is where most of my research centers about agriculture, right? So that's where you first get microcredit for agriculture. And there they got a little bit more sophisticated. So there the microcredits, the microloans for the beneficiaries of the Decree Law 259 and 300 are collateralized by future projected production. So there's a little bit of collateral there, but again the amounts are very small, and the entity, there's no Banco de Fomento de Crédito Agrícola Cubano or nothing like that privately owned. There's just it comes from those two banks, from the Banco Popular de Ahorro and mainly from the Banco Popular de Ahorro. One final comment, and I'll be very brief. For agricultural microcredit, you have to go through the ANAP. Okay, so you have to, it's not just, and you have to have a record, a credible record, and I believe is 3 harvests of proven records of production to qualify. So that's the only lending standard that I found. So I give you sort of an inconclusive story, but that's where we are. Okay.
Well, two things. First, on the currency issue, like Azel said, we don't need to know what the rate is. But what you would do in a normal country, you can do it one way. You can let the rate float. That's one way. Another way, that would be very hard. Another way is to manage the float. And depending on how much, once you move the exchange rate, you're likely to get either more foreign investment, more remittances. You're likely to sell your services, not only goods, your services. When the inflow is likely to be larger, So you have to manage the rate. You know, it will be very difficult for any country to just, let it float completely. And if you do it correctly, if you do it within a macroeconomic framework, and you get some assistance from the IMF and the World Bank, then you get a stock of besides the flow, you get a stock of foreign currency that you can deal with and manage flow. So is it 24 to 1? I don't know. It's not 24. It's not 1 to 1 either. It's somewhere between there. Somewhere between. On the question of the foreign debt, yes, there has been some negotiations with the Russians, and very fruitful negotiation. The Japanese basically le dieron una quita de $1.4 billion, and I think the French are doing. That's likely to have an impact, but not much of an impact unless you have again, I go back to, a proper economic framework, macroeconomic framework. We don't know really, again, what the foreign debt is. It goes, I think the estimates go from 17 to 30 billion, from 17 billion to 30 billion. But if they have successful negotiation with the Paris Club, yeah, that will have a great impact, because that will open up a lot of the credit and stuff like that. But
We have one question
I have
here.
a comment. I have a comment about what Dr. Azel says about the legal structure of the Cuban. What can they offer to the foreign investor? They don't have an independent judiciary system, and in the case that there is a litigation, who's going to put the money there? And if there is any problem with the Cuban government, it's going to be an independent judicial court what they is going to decide in favor of the Cuban government or the investor. This is crazy. This is one comment. And to Carlos Quijano, one question. If the foreign investor, let's suppose in Mariel, invest for a factory, and they are not allowed to hire people directly. If they like an engineer or some special guy, they are not allowed. They have to ask the government to supply them an engineer. So this is something that any country that in any country that you invest, you are allowed to choose where you want to work for you. So that is going to be if that Senor Quijano think that it's going to affect that incapacity of the investor.
well, you have to distinguish two things. If let's say on the last question, if you are a foreign investor and you want to bring an engineer from outside, that's fine. Once you go through all, the permits and it's a very bureaucratic system to get the permission. It has to go to the Council of Ministers and to the Consejo de Estado. But once you get the permit, then if you want to bring somebody from the outside, according to the law, you can bring somebody from the outside. But if you want to hire a resident, not necessarily a Cuban, a resident of Cuba, you have to go through the system of the government employing you, and then they pay you in pesos, and they get the transaction in dollars or whatever currency they're dealing. Now, on your first question, you're correct, of course, but in this law, they have also created a different type of mechanism. If there is a problem, then you go to the local judiciary system, and you can go a system all the way to the Supreme Court. However, they do have set a system of international arbitrage. In other words, if a foreign investor goes to Cuba, gets into a conflict with somebody, they have to go first through the Cuban laws. Once they don't get a favorable treatment on the Cuban law, they still can go to an international arbitrage system. Let it be the International Chamber of Commerce, whatever they decide to. But you're right, there is no such a thing as, the foreign investment law is It's basically a copy, in a sense, of the foreign investment law that the Taiwanese and the Chinese developed many years ago, to have an enclave in order to have foreign investors in that enclave.
Carlos Alberto Montaner defines the system as el Estado proxeneta, which is a very, very good way of defining the system, how it uses is that.
Yeah, two quick comments. One, I think it was Juan Tamayo who some time back reported on a Canadian investor in prison in Cuba. So it's not only a question of dollars and cents. If you're an investor, you go to Cuba, you end up in some kind of difficulty. Don't assume that you're in Madrid where you get a lawyer and you might go out on bail or something. That's something that I think investors need to take into account. And the other thing on Mariel, we have a great potential, but not now. A great potential once the American market, that's a comparative advantage of Cuba, is open, then yes, Mariel would mean something. But in the absence of an American market, Mariel has one good thing for the Cuban government. That's where the North Korean ships come by, and that's where the missiles and the airplanes on that ship were put on the boat. And I know that there are some international agencies looking at previous North Korean ships going through Mariel. So that's I think important to keep in mind.
I think we had a question, yeah, sir.
Anyone in the panel, has anybody tried to gauge the effects of the
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Has anyone tried to gauge the effect of the underground economy in Cuba? You know,
So try to measure it, I don't know if you have tried to.
There are several studies doing that. But nothing conclusive yet. Nothing conclusive, meaning we know it's there, but no one can really stand up and say this is for sure the true value of it. But there are plenty of studies about the underground economy. The other thing is also that these numbers that are here don't include the underground economy because technically these are legally registered self-employed workers. So, right. So, but we know that there are many more, right? Those many more is a discrepancy that you see in the data. If you add up the numbers, the total self-employed and cooperatives don't add up to the private sector. So there's an estimation of the size in terms of people. So you can measure the underground economy in terms of the number of employment in the underground economy. You could measure it in terms of the output generated by the underground economy, and then you could measure it in terms of the flows back and forth from the underground economy to the formal economy. So there's studies, but no one really can tell you, is it 20% of GDP? Is it 30% of the labor force? No real hard data on that.
We also know that a big chunk of the self-employed were previously in the black market.
Yeah.
So this is a way of the government to bring them out into the open.
Yeah, that's right.
Young lady, you had a question?
Yes, I wanted to ask all the panel members, how much inflows of foreign exchange can bring to the Cuban government its latest policy to export teachers and nurses and engineers and whatever to Brazil? Because so far they have done it to Venezuela and Africa, I think some African countries, but nowhere else they have done it with so much success as the Venezuelan episode that I'm sure that they fear it can end soon and in a very bad form, so they're preparing. But do you think that this maneuver is going to produce to them the same inflow of foreign exchange that Venezuela is producing right now?
I mean, the pimp state, to use it's one of the largest, if not the largest source of foreign currency for Cuba. I don't know if you want to expand on
Well, the first thing to say about that is Cuba doesn't publish balance of payment figures, so really we're guessing at it, basically. I think for the last several years, the remittances and services had really increase more than exports. Like for instance, let's say goods exports are about 6 billion. Total goods and services is about around 16 billion, 17 billion dollars. So you can figure out that how much has increased. Is it likely to increase more in the future? I doubt it very much. It's not likely to. Basically, it's not likely to take the place of the Venezuelan inflows in the future.
Let me make a comment here, going back to the foreign direct investment, whether Cuba can attract or whether it's going to be successful. My particular academic discipline is international business, and I try to look at what international businesses look for. And when we look at that literature, there are fundamentally three reasons why businesses invest overseas. One is looking for a particular resource, what we call resource seeking, and that resource is there. You know, if you want copper, you invest in Chile. Cuba can attract some level of resource-seeking investment, beautiful beaches, regarding tourism, some agricultural products, but a handful, yes. The second reason why companies invest overseas is market seeking, trying to produce in country to satisfy the needs of that country. Well, Cuba is not a huge market, 11 million people, a very poor market, and I suspect most companies that want to satisfy the needs of the Cuban market would produce abroad and try to import. I mean, if Cuba needs flat screen TV sets, you would probably produce them in Mexico and try to ship them to Cuba rather than to set up a manufacturing plant in Mariel to do that. And finally, efficiency seeking, looking for a lower labor cost in most cases. Well, as Carlos pointed out, with this particular mechanism that Cuba uses where you have to pay the government market wages and then the government pays the worker in pesos, you don't find an efficiency-seeking type of investment. So the rationale for investment really is not there for the most part, at least from my perspective. We have time for one more question, and then we're going to take a 15-minute break. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to make a comment about what Mr. Calzon says at the end, that what they are intending to do is to preserve the system. And because my experience, I have an office in China for 25 years, and I see that their reforms intended to preserve the system, and they have been successful, but in reality, they didn't want to preserve only, they wanted to enhance to the life and to increase the level of life of the Chinese people, and their intention is to take China to a level, China and their people to a good level of living. In the case of Cuba, they do try to preserve the system, but the system is not a socialist system. It's a system of a family who wants to preserve their privilege, and they have the blood in their hands, so they don't want to be derrocated, as se dice, derrocado, and be in front of a tribunal. So what they are trying to do is preserve their system of mistreating the Cuban people.
Well, one way to illustrate.
That's it. And that's why in the presentation of Gonzalez-Corzo, he said the Foforera repair, things like that, because they are not interested in increasing the standard of living of the Cuban people. They just want to keep it like that.
The Chinese reforms were far more profound than the reforms that General Castro has introduced. But perhaps just as importantly, when Deng Xiaoping introduced reforms in China, I guess 40 years ago now, he introduced those reforms with also a change in mindset. You may recall that he made the now famous quote of, "To get rich is glorious." General Castro has made it clear that the accumulation of wealth will not be permitted. So we do have a dramatic difference between the two. One more.
Woman, I just wanted to answer. I usually don't get involved into political question, but I want to address your issue. We've seen this Kabuki theater before, many times. So, the government saying one thing, the government saying another thing. But when the chips are down, once, at least with this government, the government is very clear of what the policies is. The policy is actualización del modelo, that basically. And some of the internal critics have it very clear too. It's a kind of a state capitalism system with a very, very small private sector, permitted private sector, as long as it doesn't get out of hand. That's the model. And once the chips are down, I don't think there's not likely to be any doubt of what the issue is, okay?
All right, let's take a 15-minute break and then we'll reconvene on the political side of things. Thank you.
Thank you.